Hi, folks, and welcome to the December 19th Resource Planning Advisory Group meeting with Puget Sound Energy. We just started the live stream, so if you're here, thanks for joining us. We'll get started in just a few minutes, right at 2 o'clock. Hi, folks, and welcome to the December 19th Resource Planning Advisory.
I'm confirming the live stream is up and running.
Perfect. Thanks, Emily. Hi, folks. Welcome to the live stream. This is the December 19th Resource Planning Advisory Group meeting with Puget Sound Energy. We're going to be getting started right at 2 o'clock, so we have a couple more minutes, and thanks for joining us. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the December 19th Resource Planning Advisory Group meeting. We have one more minute, and then we'll get started. Thanks for joining us. All right, we're right at the top of the hour. Emily, do we want to let folks in if anyone hasn't been let in yet?
I think all people are here right now.
Okay, great. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. So yeah, welcome to the December 19th Resource Planning Advisory Group meeting. Hello, everyone. How are you? We are getting ready for the holidays here, and my name is Annie Kilberg-Smith. I'm with Triangle Associates. As you might recall, at the last meeting we had, I think it was November, October, Sophie and I worked together to co-facilitate your last meeting. And Sophie Glass has now left Triangle, and so I will be serving as your facilitator going forward. I am in the midst of trying to find some time with each of the advisory group members. I've talked to a few of you so far, but just trying to do some one-on-ones so we can get to know each other and your role. And if you have any feedback for us, so look out for those doodle poll requests if you do want to meet with us in the next month or so. Just for a couple logistics today, if you're an RPAG member, you should be elevated to a panelist and be able to turn your video and audio on and off. Please feel free to show your audio and or show your video if you'd like. We'd love to see you. And then for public, you should be able to hear us and see us. We will have an opportunity for public comment towards the end of the meeting at 3:50 for about 10 minutes. We have 2 minutes per person. So thanks for joining us and coming to hear information out through this group. If you have comments please go ahead and save them for then, and we will get you in the queue to share your public comments at the end of today's meeting. Okay, so with that, why don't we go to next slide, Will? All right, so here's some Zoom reminders. I think probably most of you are very familiar with these by now, but for RPAG members, if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. We're going to be taking questions throughout presentations today. We have a section for chat for us as well, and then if you need captions, please feel free to use that. It is nice if you want to read what's being set up on the screen. You can also use it to translate. Okay, go ahead and go to next slide. We have some facilitator requests for today and for all these meetings. So this is just really a place where we want to highlight the things that we're requesting of all of you to participate in a space that's constructive and discussion based, although I know there's going to be some presentations, but we're just asking you to engage constructively and courteously with all of each other, respect the role of the facilitator and us to help guide the group process. If you are using acronyms, we would ask you just to go ahead and explain those out. So I know a lot of acronyms get thrown around in these types of meetings. If you have feedback in regards to these meetings, please go ahead and use that feedback form or email them to PSE. We'll go ahead and put those items in the chat. We ask that you remain on topic. And of course, as I mentioned, public comments are going to be saved towards the end of the meeting. Okay, go ahead and go to the next slide. So today we have a safety moment, which is focused on the ever famous holiday movie, Home Alone. So Kevin McAllister's tips for holiday home safety, of course, make sure that if your home is occupied, that your lights are on, but if you leave, go ahead and turn those off. We don't want you widely advertising if you're going on vacation, no social media, word of mouth, even to law enforcement. So of course, these are meant to be a little humorous today. Of course, always let a trusted neighbor that you're leaving on vacation and make sure you don't forget your children at home and make sure that those doggy doors and any other doors are locked. So that's kind of a couple funny but serious reminders to make sure that you are in line with for the holidays. All right, next slide. So we have some speakers today. Myself will be helping us facilitate, and then we have Jennifer Colson, manager with PSE. We have Elizabeth Hosner with PSE as well, and Ray Outlaw as a manager as well. Philip Popoff is here to provide help with questions if needed or to interject as needed. Next slide. As for our agenda today, if you don't mind putting the link to the agenda and the slides in the chat, Emily, we are going to, once we get through this first introduction section, we're going to go ahead and have Ray provide us with a couple updates in regards to the recruitment and application process that's ongoing right now in an effort to recruit 2 to 4 members to the RPAG. Then we're also going to have some public webinar updates. We had 2 webinars, one in November and one in early December. So we have some stats that we'd like to share with all of you. We're going to then move into some of the technical conversations. So Jen Colson is going to focus on scenarios and sensitivities. And then Elizabeth will be focused on updated resource needs. And then, of course, we have the last 10 minutes saved for next steps and public comments. Any questions so far? Okay, next slide. All right, so with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Ray Outlaw with Puget Sound Energy to provide us with some updates. One, first on the recruitment application process, and then also providing updates on the public webinar updates and our public webinars. And then if you all have questions, we'll make the opportunity available for you to ask as we go. Okay, Ray, over to you.
Thank you, Annie, and great to see everyone today. Thanks for joining us. I know we're creeping up on the end of the month and the holidays. Will you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so as hopefully you all know, we have started recruitment for new RPAG members. That started almost a couple of weeks ago now. Meredith emailed all of you, as well as we have sent invites out through our public distribution list. That recruitment will be open until January 8th, and we have for priority consideration in there because as we have in the past cycle, we kept the application open for essentially constantly in case we got new applicants, particularly from the equity space or tribal space, and we'll continue to do that going forward. We have conducted outreach to a number of parties with a focus on tribal entities, and again, that energy equity focused organizations. We got a number of recommendations from each of you through our last RPAG meeting, and we used that to identify potential applicants and have contacted them directly. We also would just ask again that if you have colleagues or other names that you might recommend, if you wouldn't mind forwarding this opportunity onto them. The last I heard, we had about 5 applicants. That's all I know about the applicants, but we had 5 of them. We'd love to add a few more before we get to our selection process in early January. Next slide, please. So next steps, what do they look like? Again, we're going to accept applicants until January 8th, and then we'll start evaluation. We'll use the same or very similar blind scoring process with Triangle that we used in the last cycle. We aim to select up to 4 applicants who meet the requirements and really offer the best balance among our membership goals. And our intent really is to notify those applicants by February of 2025 and get them on board for our February 2025 RPAG meeting, which will be, I'm not going to say the date, it's on the last slide. I'll get it wrong, but it's late in February. And that's the end of the updates on RPAG recruitment. I guess I could pause there, Annie, for any questions before we move to the next section.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ray. Any members have questions about how the application process is going, the timeline, or if you have any suggestions or additional comments? Have you all at least seen the application process be emailed to you all? Hopefully you have. If you haven't, raise your hand, let us know. Okay. All right, well, we can keep going and move into the public webinar update.
Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. So in late November, we were scheduled to have 2 public webinars, essentially to kick off our ISP process with the public. The webinar was titled, How does PSE Plan for a Clean Energy Future? We ended up rescheduling the second webinar, which was to be on November 21st. We rescheduled it for December 5th because of the storm that impacted our region so significantly and PSE's customers. We used targeted email marketing to customers in named communities to try to drive participation, and that was highly successful. We had a record number of registrants, over 500, and attendees, 167. But we do think that number, especially the attendee number, was impacted by the reschedule because about half the attendees were planning to come to the second meeting, then we had to move it. There's a lot of change that happens there. So we are confident we lost a few there, but still record numbers. We're really excited. The engagement was really fantastic. We had 89 questions in real time. We answered almost 90% of those. We really tried hard to get to every question that we could because we know the best chance to answer a question is in real time. We will be doing a feedback summary though, so that every question gets answered and documented, and that's going out to all of the participants early next week. We also had another 150 or so YouTube streams. That was as of about a week ago. So the number has probably ticked up just a little there. And then I think the last point, and maybe the really exciting point here, is that with an audience that size, we had an opportunity to do a post-event survey. This popped up as soon as people clicked exit the Zoom meeting, gave us an opportunity to ask them, how do we do? What can we do better? We got 93 responses, so a really good response rate for something like this. And again, closer to 90% rated the meeting as good or excellent. Of course, that means not everyone thought it was perfect, and that's okay. That means we have room to improve, but we were really excited that our message landed well for those folks that were there. And we had 6 people tell us they used the Spanish translation features in Zoom. It's sort of anecdotal evidence, but at least some evidence that we were able to reach a more diverse audience and get them engaged in this process in a new way. So we're really excited about that. And I think, Annie, that might be my last slide.
Sorry, I think we have one more on next step.
Oh, that's right. Thank you.
Sorry, I was on mute.
But Quinn's got a question there, so we can pause.
Yeah. Hey, Quinn.
Hello, Quinn Weber with the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission. I am curious if the 12% of people that rated lower than good or excellent had any feedback.
It's a great question, Quinn. We're still going through the qualitative, like, people did give us text responses in some cases. Not everyone completed that question about what we can do better. So we're still going through that. I would say I don't remember anyone giving super tangible, like, you should do this differently kind of feedback, but we'll keep looking and we'll keep trying.
Thank you. And just wanted to also note that staff did appreciate that you were responding to questions in real time during the webinars.
Thanks, Quinn.
Yeah, thanks, Quinn, and thanks for going to them. I know you said you were able to attend, so that's great.
One more slide then. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're working on a summary of the meeting, and it has the 100 or so questions and responses that we'll distribute to everyone that attended. We're planning for the next version of this webinar in early 2025. Again, we're going to continue to revise our approach to marketing these events and try to expand that audience to as much as we possibly can, while also working to keep these topics at a customer kind of friendly level. We'll have our technical conversations in this group, and we'll have our public conversations over there as the intent. And again, we're just going to keep iterating and improving as we go to engage more customers directly. Thanks, Annie.
Yeah, thank you. Anybody have questions about the public webinars, how they went? Any feedback if you were able to attend? Okay, well, thanks for sharing those great numbers with us, Ray. And now I think we can go ahead and move into the next portion of our meeting. So thanks for going to the next slide. I was going to now introduce Jen Polson with PSE, who's going to take us through a presentation on scenarios and sensitivities. Want to encourage you all to interrupt us by raising your hand. We'll pause and take questions throughout. We have almost an hour for this, 55 minutes, and there's a lot of slides, but we definitely have enough time for questions and comments and discussion. So feel free to chime in as we go. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you, Jen.
Great, thanks, Annie. As Annie mentioned, I'm going to walk you through the draft scenarios and sensitivities that PSE has been working on for the integrated system plan. As she mentioned, it's a lot of information. I recognize that. So we're really hoping to, field questions as we go to make sure that we give you as much baseline understanding as we can to go forward today. So this conversation is kind of building off of the October RPAG meeting as we introduced the bookend concept to you, and recognizing that maybe it didn't make sense to everyone. So we're trying another approach today. So we'll see how that works. Next slide. So when we talk about scenario development in this integrated system plan, and I keep bringing up this bookend concept, at the highest level, something to recognize and consider is that when we're talking about scenarios, sensitivities, and the reference case within the integrated system plan, the definition and the application are the same as we have done in integrated resource plans. The difference and why we keep talking about the bookends, which hopefully will make more sense in a few moments after I walk you through a really high level analogy, is really about how we're going to leverage those scenarios to develop the plan, and kind of moving away from the idea of a preferred portfolio based on a specific scenario. So the development of these scenarios allows the company to assess the risk and opportunities under these different potential futures. These futures are things that are not within PSE's control, things such as weather, economy, customer behavior, market conditions, and other things. The ISP scenarios are developed to frame up those potential futures that PSE's customers may be likely to encounter over the next few years. And one of the great things about this integrated system plan is its focus on those near-term plan and actions. And we believe setting up these scenarios in the context of thinking about what potential future may occur within the next few years is really important and fundamental for developing a successful integrated system plan. So again, that's why we're planning to use these scenarios in this different way. So I'm about to walk you through a really high level analogy. I recognize it's very simplistic, but it does really help us understand how we're looking at scenarios and using those to develop a plan. Okay, next slide. Okay, so to do this, again, simplistic, but pretend that, you know, we're going to go on a surprise trip in March in the continental US. And in that time of year, it could be sunny, it could be snowing, and it could be raining just as likely. And I tell you, you can only bring a carry-on suitcase, but you have to pack this bag because you can't go shopping. You have to pack what's in your bag. So within this scenario, you're just as likely to end up in any one of these weather conditions, but you don't necessarily have control over which weather conditions you go into. So on the next slide, when we think about that realistic future, I may be hoping about that sunny beach vacation, but I may be just as likely to end up in the snow. So when I think of how I'm going to pull together this plan and what I'm going to put in my suitcase, I may have to evaluate the conditions within each scenario and determine what piece of clothing I will put into my bag. And this is very similar as we think about an integrated system plan and the bookend concept of I need to evaluate the range of potential realistic futures. I don't know which one I'll land in, but I need to understand the investments required under each scenario to know what risks and opportunities the company needs to look at to ensure that we're packing our suitcase effectively. I'll pause.
It looks like we've got at least one question, so folks feel free to raise your hands. Lauren.
Hey, thanks, Jennifer. I just want to be honest. I'm struggling to understand this nuance that you guys are presenting. I don't understand how it's different than what we currently do in the IRP. I mean, yes, the future is uncertain. We agree, and that's always been the case. And that's the purpose of scenario planning, is to evaluate, you know, different futures with different conditions. And then the company ultimately is supposed to make a decision, right, about like what's the most appropriate, or I mean, using the old language, the preferred portfolio of resources that are going to have the best likelihood of you know, serving PSE customers with reliable and affordable energy in the uncertain future. And so I got to admit, like, I'm just struggling to understand why this is being reframed in the context of the ISP, why the company wants to move away from having a preferred portfolio. That doesn't make sense to me, to be honest. And so I feel like, you know, I would like to get a better sense, hopefully in this meeting where the other RPAG members can contribute to the conversation, of like what this actually means in terms of how the ISP is going to be different than the IRP.
Thanks for that, Lauren. And Jen, is that something you'd like to there, you just found your unmute button. There you go.
Yeah, I know. Sorry, it takes me a second for some reason. Yeah, no, it's a good point, Lauren. And I understand, I think a majority of this, like 80%, isn't new, like you're mentioning. It's very much the same. It's just about developing that plan. I think previously in an IRP, we didn't have actions oriented with the portfolio, right? And now as we move into an ISP, there's components that require us to have that action plan. And where we're trying to go and the struggle with the preferred portfolios in prior IRPs, that preferred portfolio ended up being, you know, the reference case or one of the scenarios with maybe a sensitivity or some sort of assumption change, right? And what we're saying is that was good, but we'd like to leverage the information and the knowledge from these scenarios to understand if we should be planning for something more than that. and what it means from an infrastructure investment perspective within the action plan framework timeline. So like that first, I think rules are still defining what that time frame would be, but I think it was roughly 1 to 4 years, and then the 5 to 10. And I also would say that I think it takes some time to grasp exactly what we're trying to say. I recognize these forms are difficult to explain all these things. So maybe once we get through the material, it might make more sense. But, or it looks like other people have comments too, so maybe that'll help as well.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren, and thanks, Jen, for acknowledging that this is difficult to convey in this format and just in general. So Lauren, feel free to raise your hand again, but I'm going to go to Aliza and then Ezra. So Aliza.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
And see me, I guess?
Yes, hi.
Hi. So Jennifer, I really was thinking about this too, and I appreciated the framing, and I really also appreciate Lauren speaking up because I have had some confusion on this too. Is this about more somewhat how you run the model to create the portfolios? Is there a different way that you're thinking about like running the optimization model to create the portfolios? And then, you know, that's in my simple mind, I was thinking, oh, you're not going to optimize across each of these different scenarios to look at the differences in the portfolios. You're going to come up with a different way to construct the portfolio and maybe a range of portfolios and then just test them in these scenarios. But maybe I'm not thinking about that right. But that's where when I hear you say this and frame it this way, I think of it more in how you're planning to construct these portfolios. Is that too?
That's a really good perspective and clarification. So when these scenarios would be run as they're traditionally run in an IRP, there will be a portfolio produced for each scenario. And that portfolio, though, will include not just the electric and gas supply anymore. It'll include a customer plan and a gas and electric T&D. So it'll be all encompassing. So the definition of a portfolio has expanded. That's different. But the collective result within that scenario is the same as a prior IRP. We've just added more information for you, if you will, within that answer. So each one of these scenarios would be run through all of those planning frameworks, and we'd have answers that we could look out over the full 20-year span of that study to understand within each area what were the investments required to meet that scenario within those timeframes. And then I think where it's getting confusing is previously, like I mentioned, we'd pick like the reference case for the preferred portfolio and say, this is our plan. And what we're saying is, I want to look at that reference case, but I also want to really understand the impacts of all these scenarios as well and understand the nuances between them as I think about those different planning groups and those investments that are required to ensure that we're making the appropriate investments that are needed. And I think in the October meeting, I used the gas portfolio as an example where we had a graphic that showed all of the investments across the scenarios in like a horizontal graph. And essentially what you could see was there was in the prior IRP in 23, right? SWAR, for example, was a resource that was offered within the gas portfolio, and it showed up in every single scenario. So if we're just pointing out that's what I mean is like, if I look at all these weather conditions and SWAR is in every single one, then that seems like a valid thing to move forward with. And the flip is also true. If SWAR only showed up in one, but it doesn't show up in all the others, is there a reason to not do that? And let's just understand the risks and opportunities by making those decisions. And that would be true for, all the different planning groups. Again, focusing on the near term. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, no, that helped me. But I think there's more to it with all the, each one has like X set of plans, and this is more comprehensive because it's gas and electric together. And so all the infrastructure that would go behind it, which sounds like it's much more in depth. But I think, it'd be good to hear Ezra and Lauren and everybody else. So thank you.
Thanks, Aliza. Okay, Ezra.
Yeah, actually, that explanation just now I thought was really helpful in terms of looking at the implications across scenarios. But what I wanted to ask about was the time scale. You've mentioned a few things. In the previous slide, it said over the next few years, which sort of piqued my interest because, like, what's a few years? And then, I mean, it seems like it's still a 20-year plan, but there are different focuses on the near term, 1 to 4 maybe, and then 5 to 10. So if you could say a little bit more about the interplay and what you're looking at over those different timescales, that would be very helpful.
Yes. I'm glad that kind of worked. I should write that down and so I can use it again because it's a difficult concept to explain. But to your question about the time scale, so in HB 1589, it talks about some different time parameters regarding like essentially the CETA Clean Energy Implementation Plan. It talks about those timeframes which were used from the prior CETA bill, but in rules, they're still defining what those timeframes would be. And so when we look at the ISP, because of the breadth of the information that would be used, we thought it would be really helpful to incorporate as much of the overall system into those near-term and longer-term actions as we can. So we're working to figure out how we can do that, and we're waiting for rules to be defined on those time periods specifically. We're still going to look at the full 20 years, but we think it's important to really focus on the near-term actions and how we can not only do things that are needed for safety reliability today, but also ensure that we're making investments in the near term that also lend itself to bet for the longer term needs as well.
Okay, that's very helpful, and we'll talk about that again
Oh, we will.
later on when you talk about the gas and when we're going to start actually doing anything about that. So we'll get to that later this evening, I guess.
I'm sure. Yeah. Well, and probably other conversations as well.
Thanks,
Lauren,
Jim.
yeah, no worries. Lauren, did you have another question, or was that?
No, I think we'll get to it later.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you all so far. And Ezra, your hand's still up, but I think that's residual, so I'll have Jen keep going.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so these are the definitions for reference, scenario, and sensitivity. Again, hopefully these are familiar to you as they should be. Again, they're the same essentially as the IRP. So when we talk about a reference case, we're looking at current laws and requirements. If current and or expected future conditions continued. And then when we think of scenarios, as I kind of walk through, we're looking at those larger scale impacts, that things that are outside of PSE's control. So they're not an alternative or a preferred outcome. They establish the range of energy needs for gas and electric that the candidate resource portfolios must deliver. And then when we talk about a sensitivity, which we'll also talk about today, this is looking at changing one aspect of a reference case to determine its impact on the results. So really just testing that robustness of the reference case if other factors can change.
We have a question from Katie. Now is a good time.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I am still trying to wrap my head around this, but I'm curious, for the sensitivity definition, why is it that it would only be changing one aspect of the reference case? Is there potential to change like an aspect of a scenario instead? Could you kind of walk through that a little bit more?
Yeah, that's kind of how it's actually been in all the IRPs. When we talk about a sensitivity, we're just testing something, like a price point or something against the reference. And it's even more important now as we enter an integrated system plan because of the magnitude of the analysis with all the planning groups. We're trying to reframe the scenarios to be more larger load impact scenarios that would need to optimize across gas and electric, whereas a sensitivity is really changing one aspect of the reference case to help us understand how impactful or unimpactful that one variable would be. And I do have, a list of the sensitivities within this deck, but I also have a spreadsheet that I'm going to show you guys and we'll send to you after this as well for you to take and sit with, and it defines all of those different assumptions. So if Katie, if you get into the scenarios and you think other components should be changed, like we welcome that feedback and are interested in hearing about that as well.
Got it. Thank you. I think I have to mull this over a little bit and figure it out. Appreciate it though.
Yeah, no worries. I've been thinking about it for a while, so I understand.
All right. Well, no more questions for now, so I think you can keep going, Jen.
Okay, let's go to the next one. So we wanted to just take a moment and recognize all the feedback we've received from the October meeting that was really helpful. And it's represented here on the screen. All the things on teal we believe we are incorporating into the scenarios and sensitivities. The only thing we're not directly including in this 27 ISP is that thermal energy networks. And that's because of a couple of reasons. One, it's really emerging tech at this point. There are some pilots going on and we recognize that, but it hasn't been scaled. So we don't currently have plans to model that explicitly within the 27 ISP at this point. But we're continuing to watch and evaluate how that takes off. I'll also note that, again, that's what's so nice about when we consider these scenarios from a bookend perspective. If the end goal is to really understand the load shift off of the gas system, we will understand those impacts to the electric system, whether that customer is electrified or using a thermal energy network. From a macro scale, it's a similar impact to the electric infrastructure. Any questions on this before I move on?
Yeah, Quinn.
So you're incorporating everything in teal. And to what extent are you incorporating some of these things? Obviously, like meeting 2% achievement is a legal standard, but something like data centers and AI is a bit more opaque.
Yeah, good question. I think we're going to get into it as we talk about the scenarios. And like I mentioned, we have an Excel spreadsheet with details regarding all the different assumptions. So we'd be obviously open to people's feedback on that. So, and I can try and point those items out as we go through that, if that's helpful.
It is, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, you keep going, Jen.
Okay, next slide. Okay, now we're getting into some of the meat. So we thought it was helpful to lay it out this way first, and then I'll describe each one of these next, so don't worry. But at the higher level, when we look at these proposed draft scenarios, we're essentially laying them out from a magnitude of clean electrification. Again, kind of that bookend weather condition concept of we want to make sure we understand the highest and the lowest and a couple of points in between that curve so that we understand the infrastructure investments or de-investments needed to accommodate each of those scenarios. So on the x-axis, on the far left, you can see that's the slower electric load growth and the modest net gas growth. And on the far right, you have the highest electric load growth and the highest gas load reduction. And then on the y-axis, it's the bottom is the lowest electric system investment and the high is the highest electric system investment. And you can see the scenarios we're going to talk about today for proposed draft scenarios are referenced all the way to a high plus. And so just kind of keep this visual in mind as we talk about the scenarios in greater detail in a few moments.
Oh, and I see Megan's hand just popped up. Megan?
Thanks. So yeah, on this slide, are you viewing one of these as the drivers of the other? So for instance, are you viewing scenario number 4 as high investment driving higher electric load growth and higher gas load reduction? Or are you viewing the x-axis or the y-axis as the driver of the other? Or are they both happening at the same time? If you could talk a little bit more about that, that'd be really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it'll also become more clear too once I dive into the definitions. But to your point, I guess it's a good one. The x-axis is kind of driving the investments right on the electric system. So if that helps. And then I think as I get into the details, maybe that'll become more clear as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, next slide. Sorry, I forgot I was supposed to say that. Okay, so the reference case. So again, this is incorporating current laws requirements while assuming existing programs and investments continue at a similar rate. So I have 4 slides of these, right, for each scenario. On the left, you'll see the assumptions, and these are related to the reference case. So we're trying to articulate as we go through each one of these how these scenarios are changing. And then on the right, there's a note on here about 2030, but there's also conditions that change within each scenario. So I'll start on the left side with these assumptions. So the reference case will use the forecast, demand forecast for gas and electric that will be developed in 2025. This will incorporate, obviously, whatever existing laws and requirements we have. At this point in time with Initiative 2066, we see that as including gas appliance conservation, and recognize that there are some building code restrictions being removed. We are, just to answer your question around gas growth, we're currently still working through that and trying to determine what builders and I guess builders, yeah, are going to do if with that building code exactly, and if there'll be actions or not. So that's still an open item that we're working through. We also have customer program adoption continuing for those CEIP targets that have been established. We have included or plan to include the current electrification pilots, the low income electrification through the Climate Commitment Act funding, and then also incorporating the reference electric vehicle adoption forecast. On the right, okay.
It looks like Lauren's hand is up. If you don't mind taking that question, Jen.
Yeah, no worries. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Hey, Lauren.
Thanks, Jen. I'm scratching my head trying to make sense of why the reference case would be dependent on the commission approving the ISP or like approving additional funding for electrification. I mean, there's electrification happening regardless of what PSE is doing with its programs, right? And so I think, that was a big part of the company's direct testimony in their current rate case, et cetera. And so I understand the policy assumptions here and why you guys are pulling back on, the building codes and what 1589 did to the gas appliance conservation. I get that. I just think there's a lot of stuff happening out there and that I've heard the company talk about that is not policy driven necessarily, but is customer driven. And so I'm curious why we're assuming, how does that factor into the company's electrification assumptions, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, and you're referring to this box on the right that says no.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I guess first, this box on the right kind of applies more to the other scenarios than the reference. I think we just kind of space-wise, whatever it ended up here, which was a little confusing to your question, but okay, so the note on the screen is in reference to the electrification programs beginning in 2030. So as you mentioned, natural electrification, right, unincentivized electrification that occurs on customers is happening naturally, and we've are incorporating that into the base reference forecast in 2025 as well. So that will be in this reference case. This 2030 note here is really in reference to additional widespread electrification incentives that the company would offer that are really evaluated in the following scenarios. And we're just flagging that we're kind of seeing that as taking off in 2030 for a couple of reasons. One is that formal approval that you talked about with the commission, because we're a little unclear. We're unclear if PSE is authorized to fund this at a larger scale, and recognizing that we likely won't get approval on the ISP until 2027, at the end of 2027, meaning those programs couldn't start scaling until 2028, if by then, and maybe there would be more work to do that. So we're just trying to align again, coming back to that action plan idea and those near-term actions with reality to the best that we can, because there's also this component in bullet number 2 regarding timeline and constructability. So if we have to do not just the electrification programs, but if we need to do work on our system as well, that takes time to do. I think distribution work is like 3 to 4 years lead time, not only just from a site permit, but also materials can take that long too. So this allows us to align our plan with reality and deliver in the timeline that everyone is expecting us to do that. Did you have another question?
I do. I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
And you know, when you talk about siting and permitting for like electrification, I mean, what are you actually talking about there? I mean, the company doesn't need to go do major permitting and design changes for customers to install heat pumps, right? Like what is it that you're talking about? And if it's just, you know, regular distribution line upgrades, I mean, that I don't know, that to me is kind of just part and parcel of like business as usual operations for the company, and is kind of should be, I think, divorced from these decisions about what kind of like incentive programs you're offering. But anyway, if you could speak a little bit to what you mean with like siting, permitting, and design.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely agree. Yeah, we're not permitting your house for your heat pump. That's a different area, obviously. This is referring to the system infrastructure. And I think, so it's 2024 now, right? And this ISP won't be published until early 2027. So there is time between now and then to develop these plans and incorporate it into this ISP. When we talk about 2030, that's only 3 years from this point. So as you mentioned, like, we have to serve our customers, and we are continuing to upgrade our system to accommodate whatever load changes are needed. So to your point, that's business as usual, but just if we're going to try and really drive a transition in electrification outside of something that is currently offered, that would impact the system, right? And we need to plan to align to that. We don't want to have everybody electrify in one area if we know that we can't take it on our system. So we need to get that in the plan, and so that we could actually build it in a timely manner.
Great, thanks, Jen. I have another question from Ezra.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on that, I mean, what I found a little bit alarming about that same note is that it says begin in 2030. And it seems like now you're saying, well, that's partly because there's a lot of ramp up in system design and everything. But, you know, the electrification programs have to include all of that so that you have something to design around as you're doing the upgrades to support it. So when you say begin, are you talking about like implementation, actually offering these programs to customers? Are you saying like we're going to take 3 additional years after 2027 before we're even getting the program designs in place?
I think the first one, like begin implementation. So all that work would have to happen before, as you mentioned. So that's why there's like the lead time of getting the approval, getting everything prepared to actually full scale the programs, if that's, what we do.
Okay, the years just keep ticking by, but that's not your fault. Thank you, Jen.
No worries. Okay, so, and again, this note is really for the other slide, so maybe it'll make more sense in a moment, hopefully. So the next slide, scenario 2. This is the mid. So again, thinking of that curve, where do we fall to ensure we're getting all these different points to understand the investments that are needed, is it incorporates current laws and requirements while assuming additional requirements and funding to increase building electrification and EV adoption at a rate that's based on equipment failure and market adoption with an incentive. So for example, this would be looking at in 2031, your furnace may die. But at that point in time, there is a market adoption curve for customers to, transition to a heat pump. Not everyone wants a heat pump at that point in time. But over time, Cadmus has a curve, and over time, 100% of customers transition. So in 2131, technically, maybe 60% of people buy the heat pump, but maybe 30% still prefer the furnace for whatever reason. So that's just how we're just trying to articulate that. And the incentive, obviously, as you guys kind of allude to, like influences and helps with the adoption rate of that technology. So we'd include those two things together. On the left side of the screen, this is similar for all the slides. This is looking at the reference case assumptions. They're the same as the prior slide. We're just showing you the differences to help clarify. You can see the reference case EV adoption is crossed off because on the right, we're looking at a mid EV adoption. So increasing that EV load while also increasing the electric load and decreasing the gas load at the same time within that time frame.
All right, couple questions popped up. So Katie's first.
Yeah, I think I have a couple questions on this slide. I guess you're talking about the kind of electrification rate based on equipment failure and this kind of adoption curve. Do we have a sense of what that rate is already for this mid-case scenario? And then I'm also curious if that same assumption is baked into the reference case, as in, there is some sort of adoption when people's equipment fails and they'll take up heat pumps, or if their AC goes out, something like that.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, and sorry to skip ahead like that. So we've done a decarbonization study the last year, and then in the 23 IRP as well, did a lot of work with Cadmus. And Cadmus did a survey to customers to evaluate their willingness to transition to a heat pump from a furnace. And so they collected a lot of data that was pulled together for that study. So that's the curve I'm referring to that we would likely be leveraging. And to your point, even in the reference case, they do incorporate, their analysis of looking at what is it that customers are using and how does that change over time for the technical potential. But I think the incentive is a helpful driver, and other government funding, right, to change technology preferences for customers that we'll have to consider as we develop this.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Katie, did you have anything else? Okay. All right. Well, then I'll go to Quinn next.
Yeah, I'm a little curious, but what is the difference between the reference EV adoption scenario and the mid EV adoption scenario? Is this just the rate to which people are voluntarily purchasing or switching to electric vehicles, or is it something different?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So much like prior IRP work that we've done, we've purchased a EV forecast from Guidehouse, and they've kind of been the experts that we've leaned on for the development of those forecasts because it's a really complicated question. And traditionally, we've gotten a kind of a low, mid, high EV adoption that are in alignment with the state's goals regarding the clean fuel standard. So that's what we're referring to. We don't have that EV forecast yet, but it would be in context with thinking about if we're going to mid electrification where customers are purchasing and making those investments into the electrification space as an economy, then we may have people also transitioning their vehicles as well at a higher rate than the reference case.
Thanks, Quinn. Thanks, Jen. No more questions for now.
How are we on time, Annie?
We're good. We've got another 25 minutes.
Okay, cool. Okay, so the next slide is the high scenario. So this incorporates, again, those current laws and requirements, assuming additional requirements are incorporated for building electrification and EV adoption at a rate based on equipment failure to meet the Combined Utility Climate Commitment Act allowance line. So on the left, you can see those are the reference case assumptions. Again, we've kind of crossed off things that we think would not be included in this scenario, so open to ideas on that as well. And then on the right, we're kind of stating those changes. So the electric utility and the gas utility have allowance lines from the Climate Commitment Act. That's a tongue twister. So we're looking at them coming together, since it's an integrated system plan, and seeing if we electrify at that rate with the constraint that equipment must be at failure. So we're not pulling out equipment before it fails. What would that look like? Obviously, this would change the electric and gas demand forecasts respectively. And then we would remove that gas appliance conservation and building code changes, because if we're in this space, then those no longer seem reasonable to us at that point. And then as well as the high EV adoption, kind of coming back to Quinn's question previously. So that would be there. And the thought process on that for the high EV, again, is if we're investing in all this new electrification, maybe we're investing even more in moving quicker on the transportation front as well.
All right, question popped up, Quinn.
Yeah, I'm curious as we start to get into these high electrification scenarios, where electrification at pace continues to start in 2030, but it sounds like the scenario demands that electrification at pace may need to start sooner than that. Am I wrong in thinking that, or is that?
For this one specific, that's a good question. And for this one specifically, I think kind of still out on that. If we combine the emission lines together from the gas and electric utility, because of the investments and the reduction on the electric system, this timeline I think is okay. We'd be below that line and starting in 2030, to be very specific. So it works.
Okay, thanks, Jen. Not seeing any other questions for now.
Okay, make it to the last one. Okay, so high plus. We didn't know what to call it, so we call it high plus. This is essentially very similar to the last high scenario, not to be confused with high, where we're looking at the current laws and requirements, assuming additional requirements are incorporated for building electrification to meet the Combined Utility Climate Commitment Act allowance line. Again, on the left, you can see the changes from the reference case, and on the right, we're highlighting specifically some of those changes. So the difference between scenario 4 and scenario 3 is really that burnout equipment failure. So this is saying, well, what if that didn't matter? What if we had to hit those, the free allowance line? What would that look like? So that's forcing those in. This would change the electric and gas demand forecast. Again, looking at that high EV adoption.
When?
So I'm curious about how PSE is planning to incorporate other ways of emissions reductions other than electrification, because there is other energy efficiency measures and demand response to be had. And so I'm trying to work out why or where that might fit into the reference scenarios at this point.
Yeah, great question. I think when I pull up the spreadsheet, you'll see it, all those things you just mentioned on there. You know, when it comes down to it, currently in the near term, the volume of DR that we could get on the system is not as impactful as building electrification. So we're really just highlighting those big load drivers in these slides here, but we have all the information as consideration and inputs into all of these scenarios that I'll show you as well to help clarify. And so if you have thoughts on those, you know, too, please feel free to share.
We'll get to that in just a few slides. And in the meantime, I see Megan has her hand up as well.
Yeah, I had a similar question to Quinn. I'm just trying to make sense of how PSE can meet the Climate Commitment Act's trajectory just constrained by equipment failure. I'm wondering, I don't see alternative fuels on here, and I know in previous IRPs, PSE has incorporated alternative fuels into their trajectories. Is that an assumption in any of these scenarios? And can you talk a bit about that? Thanks.
Yeah, Megan, great question. And good point. Again, I think we were just so focused on those big load shifts and highlighting that framing. In the spreadsheet, we have all those assumptions. So we do plan to incorporate alternative fuels as well. And so I'll highlight for you where those are, and you can see those specific assumptions within each scenario.
Thank you.
Right.
Yeah, no worries.
No other hands are up, Jen, so thank you. And I know you have a couple more slides. We've got about 15 minutes left for this section.
Okay, cool. I think we're making good progress then. So this is all of those scenarios we just talked about, kind of just laid out differently because, you know, everyone likes a different graphic. On the left is, again, that bottom part of that curve. And then on the right, the high plus is all the way to the top of that curve. And again, just kind of reframing these as we think about that silly analogy regarding the weather. You know, these are different weather conditions, and we're trying to understand how these different loads on the gas and electric system optimized together would create different portfolios and how our investments may change to accommodate them. And then at the end of the day, how should we use that to make a decision on what we should plan to do? So kind of just a different visual, same information, but not referencing all the stuff you just asked about Quinn and Megan regarding DR and alternative fuels, which I'll show in a moment. Okay, can go to the next one. Okay, so to complicate matters, before I show you the Excel, yeah, here's the sensitivities that we've been pondering about for this integrated system plan. As noted, this is not an exhaustive list. I think a really cool thing about an integrated resource plan and this integrated system plan, especially now that we're going to have so much information across all different aspects of planning, is that we'll get into it, we'll run these scenarios, and they tend to trigger more questions, right? And so other sensitivities may come out as needed based on information and based on your guys' feedback, but we have them kind of separated just by the fuel source, so electric and gas, or the utility, the electric and gas utilities, because these specific items we think impact more specifically either the gas or the electric side. So it's a list, it's not exhaustive. So, you know, again, open to feedback and thoughts on things that we should add or take away on the list that we have here. You can pause.
Question from Quinn?
Sorry, I have quite a bit of questions on this slide.
No, it's okay.
Go ahead.
So where to start? I guess I'll start with the WEC average emissions rate. Could you explain that a little more?
Yeah, I'll do my best. So this is where we get to really technical specific areas. So I'll do my best to answer. Within the electric portfolio, as I understand it right now, on the supply side, we have a emission rate that's set through CETA. We also run a electric price model that provides us with a regional WEC emission rate. And this emission rate reflects that market, and it changes over time with the clean energy goals across the Northwest. And so that's a lower emission rate because as time goes on, the market also gets cleaner, which is a bit different than the emission rate that we get from the CETA requirement. So we like to look at it both ways.
I know, Quinn, you said you had a couple questions.
I do, but I will let Katie jump in because
We'll
she has.
Sure, we'll circle back to you. Go ahead, Katie.
Oh, I also have a couple questions. Sorry.
Good.
I'm curious in these sensitivities if there's any room to do some sort of like updated load forecast. I thought I saw that there was going to be kind of the 2025 reference forecast, and curious if there's time permitting to kind of get an updated forecast in. I'll pause there before asking my other ones.
It's a great question. We don't currently have a plan to do a full load forecast update. That would require kind of reworking the CPA and a lot of other really upfront analysis that is required for the rest of the chain to complete their analysis. But I will say, never say never. There's always, if there's some sort of big triggering change that we feel drastically impacts the load within the next few years for whatever reason, we will do our best to accommodate those changes. So that was a really wishy-washy response. Apologies.
No, I appreciate that. So essentially, if you see big changes out there, you will kind of respond to that.
Yeah.
Just two more questions. I'm curious if you could explain a little bit more about the emerging technology viability scenario, what that actually looks like, and also the more renewable natural gas scenario, kind of the details around those.
Yes. So I think and again, we numbered and lettered these just to help with clarity. So you guys could reference them easier. So F that's the one you're referring to for the emerging technology?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. So yeah, right now, SMR nuclear is not commercially available at the scale. So when we were talking about these scenarios, if there is information, I think we ran it in the prior IRP, we'll use that technology into the portfolio and to see if it's selected. We may also look at what if we had it be selected just to see what it would do to the portfolio. The reason we call it emerging tech is, again, just because it's not commercially available. So we wouldn't want that to be some sort of near-term action if you can't actually purchase that technology. And same with advanced geothermal, et cetera, right? All the emerging tech. So as much information as we can get to model it, if we're able to, we will. Oh, and sorry, you asked me about something else, RNG. Okay, so that was on slide number 5. Yeah, so similarly, like we have existing quantities and contracts of renewable natural gas, and we can make assumptions regarding what if there was more available, or what if we could source renewable natural gas across the continental United States. How would that change the portfolio? It's a sensitivity because those may or may not be options that we could pursue. So we don't want to necessarily build everything around it, but we want to test it and understand those impacts to the portfolio. So if it became an opportunity, we would do that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Katie, if it's okay with you, I'll go back to Quinn.
Wow, Katie must have been looking at my notes. I had similar questions, but I am also curious about the transmission availability. Like, I know in part what is like regional transmission availability at this point. PSE is starting to procure transmission all the way out to the middle of the country. Is that an impact that PSE is thinking about? And then why is it sectioned out into higher and lower regional transmission availability?
Yeah, good question. Again, these are like kind of get really technical, so I'll do my best, and PSE can or others can interrupt me. But so the lower and the higher. So the regional transmission piece has a few components, as you mentioned. A big one being Bonneville Power Administration. So they're the largest transmission provider in the region. They do large transmission interconnection studies, and so depending on who's in that transmission study and what is available to build and or who moves forward with their project, right? There's like a high optimism of like BPA will build out everything on the wish list, and then there's a low of we think only a subset of these transmission requests are going to move forward, kind of views of the world. And so when I show the spreadsheet, you'll see that we have some initial assumptions, and then we just want to test like what if BPA wasn't able to do all the things that they wanted to do, what would that look like, and how would PSC's regional transmission plans have to fill in that gap, and how does that impact the resources that are selected within that portfolio?
Is transmission availability just accounting for new transmission, or is it accounting for something like a grid enhancing technology that would potentially allow for more transmission on existing grid?
I think all of the above. We would be evaluating those new future build outs, but we always are constantly looking at ways to improve our existing system and upgrade it. So it would be looking at both opportunities. In reference to like the supply side portfolio, we found that they made a lot of improvements in the last cycle regarding how we can deliver energy and just understanding the impacts to the transmission system regarding those limitations of that power flow. So previously, like Aurora would just build wind farms wherever, and now we're really kind of sectioning off and getting more specific regarding the transmission constraints to those different pathways. And this analysis is really helpful in understanding the risks with each of those different options.
Great. And I have one last question. I'm so sorry.
No, go ahead.
For letter J, maximum conservation potential, is that going to run as 100% of technically achievable potential, or is that something different?
Yes, I believe that is what that is.
Great. Thanks everyone for all of those questions. Great discussion. Jen, I know this is the last slide, but you have the Excel worksheet preview that we wanted to do. Just to give you a time check, we have about 7 minutes.
Okay. I will take the screen share if that's okay. Okay, so bear with me. Okay, can you see an Excel file?
See, yes, the README page.
So I recognize we're running a little low on time, and the intention really was to walk you through the file just to get you oriented. And I think it's one of those things, as you guys have been alluding to with all the great questions, that you kind of have to sit with and think about a little bit deeper. So don't feel like you have to get everything answered right now. Before you go into the spreadsheet, just be aware that, so the blank cells, it's blank because it's the same input as the reference. However, I want to note that the result may change based on the demand forecast for that scenario. So for example, like the price point of CCA, so whatever the CCA allowance price, right? That could be the same in the reference case, but the volume of CCA allowance purchases will vary in scenario based on the demand and the requirement to purchase those. And then this green cell just indicates a change from that reference case. And this will make more sense when I get into it, but I just want to articulate that. So we have 3 tabs on the bottom. We have load forecast, electric planning, and gas planning. So starting on the load forecast, this and everything kind of builds off of it. On the far left of all 3 of the sheets, you will see a scenario number and a scenario, walking through those scenarios we just walked through today. And then across the top, you'll see columns that are specific inputs and assumptions within each scenario. So you can see specifically what we're kind of assuming, and we're really interested in your thoughts and feedback regarding these specific assumptions. Within the load forecasting tab specifically, you can see, the reference forecast for 2025, the code and policy assumptions, the equipment replacement. So this is that building electrification that we just kind of walked through, a hybrid heat pump assumption, EV adoption assumption forecast. And then over the right, just to highlight, since a few of you had questions, these are the customer program offerings. So we have these 2 cells that are called existing. I can't see. Okay, there we go. Columns H and I here are existing programs and products that PSE offers today. And you can see how it's, white, I guess, through the rest of the cells. And that's not because the volume of those products and projects aren't changing with each scenario. It's just because they're based on the technical potential of those different products and RFP responses. And so we anticipate that those will scale relative to their respective demand forecast scenarios, if that makes sense. And then to help just add some more context on columns J and F, these are future potential offerings that we're evaluating. So we're really excited to include as much of the future stuff as we can. So as products become available, and we will work to incorporate these within our ISP as well. Column F is looking at conservation and demand response. I think someone had a question about that. So you can see our assumptions here. The reference case is using that 2% of load and 10% of peak DR as high as commercially feasible. And then the gas is defined by cost effectiveness. So this is the load forecast tab. Any questions on orientation here? I don't think we have time to point through all the things. I do want to show you the other tabs, but just if you have a question about the framing here. Okay. So then if you go to the electric planning tab, again, you see the scenarios here. The columns are different inputs across the electric modeling. So these are likely familiar to you from a traditional IRP perspective. We have power prices, natural gas prices, CETA requirements, wind and solar shapes, hydro conditions, etc. Then when we get to the right, these are new fun additions that we have as an integrated system plan. So kind of talking about cluster study, that was the word I was looking for, is the transmission build out analysis and the assumptions. And then the local T&D system as well, demand side resources, resource adequacy metrics, etc. Again, the white columns do not mean that like volume is not going to change. It means the input is the input, and then it's scaled based on the demand. So you would anticipate that as load increases on the electric system over time, you'd have more local transmission and delivery system investments. Okay, and then the last tab here is the gas. So very similar to the electric. Again, you have the scenarios on the left. Across the top is the columns. This, again, should be familiar if you're familiar with our gas IRP. These are some of the assumptions that we have. There's alternative fuel assumptions on here. And again, we're highlighting in green changes from the reference case. But fun new add as we look at an ISP is we got the gas distribution system on here, and they really look at things in two buckets: system reliability and integrity. So to clarify, the system reliability is looking at investments that are driven by customer demand, and whereas integrity are investments that are driven to keep the system safe and operating. So they look at those two differently, kind of talk through the assumptions there. And again, just because they're white doesn't mean it's not changing. As you would go down these scenarios, because the gas demand decreases significantly, right? As you get to scenario 4, the reduction on the gas system would show up in those outputs of the analysis. Ooh, 1 minute to spare.
All right, we've got at least one question. Ezra.
So just to make sure I understand, because usually when we look at the IRPs, there's a whole bunch of scenarios that kind of have different sorts of narratives about it, historically, I should say, in IRPs. But so these are the scenarios. Like, this isn't an example of some scenarios. These are the scenarios, just mid, high, high plus, and reference, and everything else is sensitivities. Is that what I should understand, or is there still
Right. Yeah, these are a draft proposed. Do you mean the name isn't fun, or like the definition?
The names are pretty fun, but it's not, I mean, but you know what I'm talking about, right? In the electric IRPs, there have been scenarios that kind of have a more narrative description. And these are like all put, and maybe this makes perfect sense, because maybe it's false precision to try and say, oh, well, in this one we have, more residential electrification, or this one we have more, I don't know what the different examples might be, EVs, but here, like, we've tied in EVs with everything that's going on in the buildings, and tied them into the same scenarios. And that's, takes a little thinking about, and maybe it makes perfect sense, but is that a correct understanding that that's the plan?
Yes. Yep. That is correct. And it's just kind of thinking back about what's the output of the ISP, what are the goals of the ISP, and how best can we use this ISP to make those nearer term actions, and what are those different scenarios, and essentially that point on the curve. And I think historically, as you're referencing, it was very much like, oh, that would be interesting, let's look at that. And it's like, it could be interesting, but if it's not something that's going to happen and change our investment portfolio, then is it worth, all, because all these groups have to dig into that and analyze it. So, and you guys have to digest it, right?
Well,
so like,
and
what's the
also,
most value add?
I mean, a huge benefit now, you had those narratives, but you were only looking at the electric side and you weren't looking at the implications on the gas side, for example. So now at least we're looking at consistent scenarios for the whole system. So that is a huge improvement.
Right, exactly. And we're trying to optimize and what's the most meaningful, impactful way to look at that. And if you have other ideas, like, we're obviously open to those, but just thinking of it from that perspective, this seemed like a reasonable approach to us.
It's just it's a big change, but it does, thank you.
Yeah, I know. I've been sitting with it for a few months, so I'm a little ahead of the curve on the change management side, but
Okay.
Thanks. And yes, we are right at time on this section. So Jen, I know I saw the note from Ray in the chat that we're extending the typical feedback window to January 17th to give folks time to digest this. Jen, what's kind of the next steps on what you're asking folks to digest and provide feedback on?
Yeah, so as Ray mentioned, we're extending the feedback window. We're going to send you this Excel file that I just pulled up. We just wanted to be able to walk you through it because sometimes no context is less helpful. So really interested in your thoughts and feedback regarding the specific assumptions we have in there. Like, the more specific you can be, the more helpful it is. I think, as Quinn pointed out on that prior feedback, some of that stuff was really high level and ambiguous. A lot of so if you can be specific in regards to your feedback, that's very helpful to understand exactly where we are or are not aligned. And that's, so that's kind of what we're looking for that feedback on January 17th.
Okay, and that should be provided by people via email to PSE?
Yeah, or the feedback form.
Okay.
I think either way we'll get it in there.
Okay, sounds great.
Yeah.
All right, folks. Well, thank you so much, Jen. That was a lot of information, lots of great questions. Thank you all for staying engaged. And with that, we'll go ahead and move into our second presentation today. So we're going to talk about updated resource needs, and that's going to be by Elizabeth Hosner with Puget Sound Energy. So Elizabeth, if you are ready to kick us off, we had to shave off a little bit of time, so just be aware of that. But I'll keep doing time checks to make sure we stay on track.
Great, thank you. So my name is Elizabeth Hosser. I'm going to run through the updated resource need, and if any point there's questions, please feel free to ask questions. I think next slide. So I just kind of want to get back to what we mean by resource need. I know this has been a term we've thrown around, and we're going to get better at trying to describe what we're meaning by this. And so really what we're looking at for this is the first piece being meeting demands. We have a demand requirement to meet. It's how much we need to meet with demand. So that box on the far right, that's the energy deficit, the requirements. So that's looking at the demands for every hour. So we have an hourly demand we have to meet. We have to make sure we have enough resources to meet that demand. And so it's going through all the hourly demands, making sure there's enough resources to meet that. The second piece of that would be the peak capacity requirement. That's referring to the high demand hours. This is when the system peaks, when there's a lot of demand on the system. That's the peak requirements. And when we look at that, we're looking at the peak plus what we call a planning margin. And so this planning margin allows for variability given many different conditions of what could be happening. And so that's an important piece. This is really what's driving what we call the resource needs, meeting these two pieces. So those are the requirements we have in that. And then the final piece is kind of some of the more regulatory requirements. So we do have our demand, our full demand to meet. And then a piece of that would be the CETA requirements. So a certain percent of that demand needs to be met with renewable or non-emitting resources. So it's then just making sure we're tracking how much of this renewable or non-emitting resources are meeting the demand requirements. And so when we look at putting resources in, we need to make sure they are fitting each of these pieces. We have tracking each of these 3 different pieces, and making sure resources are meeting each of these, and creating kind of a set of portfolio to make sure we're meeting demand, peak demand, and the renewable requirements. Next slide, please. And so when we put this portfolio together, it's looking at these 3 different deficits and pieces together, and we'll create a portfolio. So when we go through an IRP, we'll create the portfolio. And so every time we run an optimization, we optimize on these 3 different pieces, making sure that set portfolio meets all of these 3 requirements. And we'll come up with a mix of resources that meets those requirements. And this might get a little confusing, because when we track the effective peak capacity, we're tracking that in megawatts. That's the metric we're using. And this could get complicated because when we look at a portfolio, we're listing out the total nameplate. What could this resource produce? That's also tracked in megawatts. So I think this is maybe some of the confusion that's happening between the effective peak versus kind of that nameplate for looking at the resources themselves. And then the energy requirement is tracked in megawatt hours, the total requirement in energy needed, and then the renewable requirements also tracked in megawatt hours, since that's kind of a portion off of that demand requirement. And so I think this will go into the next slide. And so really to backtrack with that peak requirement, this is the important piece. So this is really what's driving a lot of what the resources are that we're looking at, this peak requirement. And so when we look at our peak requirement, that's defined by our resource adequacy analysis. And in this resource adequacy analysis, we are looking at all the different possible futures that could happen. We do planning kind of on a normal conditions, like normal conditions, what could happen. But in a resource adequacy analysis, we're looking at all the various conditions of what could happen and trying to meet to a certain level of those different future energy demands. And some of the different metrics we may be looking at, or some of the different factors that could impact this, could be like variations in the temperatures. So rather than like normal temperatures, we're looking at what could all the temperatures happen to be during the peaks. This could be winter or summer. The demand variation, variations of the generating resources. So, instead of like normal hydro conditions, you could have lower hydro conditions or higher hydro conditions. And the same thing could be with like wind and solar. Those can vary quite a bit from year to year. So we're trying to pick up those variabilities in the resources, the temperatures, how those interact with each other. On top of the fact, you could have equipment failures. So these are like forced outage of the plants. You could have curtailments of resources, interruptions of transmission. All of these things could be happening. And what we're trying to do in the resource adequacy is account for all these variabilities that could happen. So then what we'll do is create what's called the planning reserve margin. It's usually abbreviated the PRM. And when we look at that, we look at kind of our normal peaks. This would be our demand forecast at peak. And then we add the planning margin on top of that. So it'll be a percent above the peak, which would be the planning margin to account for all this variability, to making sure we have enough resources to meet demands under many different conditions. And then with that planning margin, we'll look at how do each type of resource meet these requirements. And so that will create kind of a peak contribution for each resource. And each resource is different. And there's interactions between resources on how we build the portfolio, how we look at this, and how they can meet those requirements under the various conditions. So this is important when we start looking at how we look at the requirements, how we look at building a portfolio of resources. So I think the next slide. So what I've done here is pulled kind of from the 23 progress report. What do we mean by this? So when we created the 23 progress report, we went in there with an effective peak requirement of a 2,700 megawatts in 2030. And so we're looking at a mix of resources that can meet that effective peak requirement. And each resource meets it differently under different conditions. And so what we created was kind of a preferred portfolio, and that portfolio just happened to be a mix of different resources that can meet that peak requirement. And that mix was about 6,700 megawatt nameplate. So this is the difference between that effective peak of 2,700 megawatts versus the nameplate of those resources, the nameplate being the total contribution you can get from the resources versus how they're meeting the peaks. And this mix of resources can change over time. So this is an example from the 23 progress report. And this mix of resources was based off of different assumptions about costs and availability of these resources. And this changes. This can constantly change depending on what the economics of the resources can look like, what's available, transmission, permitting. All of these conditions can affect this mix of resources. So the actual results of what will happen can vary. It may not be exactly 6,700, it may not be exactly this mix of resources, but at the end, what we're trying to meet is that effective peak. That's the 2,700 megawatt effective peak that we're trying to meet. That's how we're measuring, making sure we're meeting the requirements, meeting what we need to have for the resources, for the resource adequacy. So I think this was kind of going through some of the examples of, how we're meeting the resource requirements kind of, and then I think my next slide should be going into the updated requirements we're now looking at. So we now have some updated numbers. This will be kind of our numbers going into the next round using their updated load forecasts, all the new resources that come into the portfolios. These are updates since we've been working on the 25 IRP. And making sure we're incorporating all that information in. So all these updates came to kind of reducing that effective peak requirement. So when we look at this, just to look at this chart on the left-hand side, what you'll see is the black line going across the top. That's that peak need plus planning margin. And this is already net of all demand side resources. So that net of demand side resources is already included in that black line. And then on the bottom, you'll see kind of the bars are the supply side resources for meeting that requirement. And then the kind of the difference between the black line and the bars, that's the deficit. That's where we're looking at what are those requirements? What do we need to meet to make sure we're maintaining resource adequacy? And so what we've updated is that deficit has shrunk since the 23 progress report with all the new resources coming in and the updated loads. We have updated planning margins and peak capacity contributions in this slide as well. And I think there's a question.
Yeah, the question from Quinn.
Yeah, I'm curious about the existing gas aspect of this chart because at a certain point, existing gas will have to actually drop off this chart as contributing to peak and or be replaced by RNG. But since this is existing gas and not all that is being served by RNG now, it's a little confusing.
Yeah, so in this chart, we do have the existing thermal plants maintaining in here. It is a quite significant contribution to those peak requirements. Some assumptions we were working with in the 25 IRP were possibilities of alternative fuels. There's a lot of possibilities of what could happen at this point. I think that requirement starts in 2045. So there is time to kind of review through those assumptions and figure out where that's going. But at this point, they're there in the picture to contribute towards peak. It would just increase the peak requirements.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Okay, no more questions for now, so I think you can keep going.
All right, so this next slide is just an example of how this mix of resources can change. This is just kind of some high end or low high end of how to meet those peak requirements. So when we look at the picture we saw in 2030, it was about a 2,100 megawatt deficit for meeting that peak capacity. Okay, so we look at this, we need 2,100 megawatts more of effective peak in 2030 for resource adequacy and to meet peak demands. So in this example, I looked at a couple different options just to show how those peak demands can be met and just some complications that can happen along the way that could change this resource mix. So in the first example, this is like a peaker. So this is kind of like a resource that's dispatchable, can meet long durations at a time for our capacity. And that contributes about a 96% peak contribution. So it's our ELCC, as we call it, the effective load carrying capability. And how that works is it's a percent of your nameplate. So for example, if you were to need 2,100 megawatts of effective capacity at a 96% ELCC, that would give you a 22,250 megawatt nameplate of resources. So that's how much nameplate of resources you need to meet this effective capacity. In the second example, I kind of worked through like a 4-hour battery example. And in this one, because it's only 4 hours, that's a limited duration example of a resource. And so as you're working through this, you have a saturation curve. So as you work through, okay, you've got 4 hours, great. As your durations start increasing for meeting these events, you'll start seeing a drop off in how these batteries can contribute to that event for meeting those resource adequacy. And so you'll see kind of a pretty sharp drop off. So like this first tranche being 98%, then it drops to 74%, and then this final one being 16%, because those are getting into those longer duration pieces. So just kind of working through just the saturation. If you were trying to do all 2,100 megawatts of deficit meeting with batteries, and so just in this example, it ends up well over 9,000 megawatts nameplate. Are you going to do all or one? It'll be a mix. And so this is what we're trying to say is like, we're going to optimize between all these resources, making sure we're meeting all the different requirements at once. This is just showing an examples of how little or how much capacity is our nameplate could be built to meet the same amount of capacity, effective capacity. So that's what's driving kind of these capacity additions, is that effective capacity and how those resources will meet this peak contribution. So I think the next slide. This is that kind of same slide as the winter, but just like that updated summer peak contribution. Again, we have the new resources coming in. They help contribute to meeting those peak effective peak capacity. It is the deficit is shrinking from the 23 progress report. So this is, of course, thanks to all the work that was being done to acquire new resources. And I think the next slide, we'll be looking at the updated clean energy requirements. So when we look at this, we are looking at some kind of modeling requirements. So when we look at modeling, we're setting this as annual targets. So we're hitting in 2030 that 80%. And in 2045, the 100%. So in this picture, we're kind of looking at a linear incline into the 80% and a linear incline to that 45 to the 100%. And then after 45, maintaining the 100%. So will the actual acquisitions be linear? Probably not. It'll be lumpy. In here, this again will be results vary. This is just a modeling assumption we going in. Really that point that we're trying to hit is that 80% and 100% of the requirements for meeting CETA. So again, we've acquired some new resources that's helping to meet the CETA requirement. So the deficit that we need to meet for clean energy has shrunk since the 23 progress report with the new resources coming in. So this is just kind of that updated requirement to meet that. And just some examples. I mean, I just assume some generic capacity factors. This could be as little as 1,600 up to 2,400 or more resources. This is some estimating to show how much, what is 5.3 terawatt hours of clean energy requirements. So just kind of some of those examples of how to meet that. So this would be meeting if you were to looking at building kind of a resources of portfolios, you would be looking at the CETA requirements. So you need to add this energy in, these resources in with their nameplate. Plus you're looking at the capacity resources for meeting the resource adequacy and peak requirements. So those would be all inclusive in a portfolio to making sure we're meeting all the different aspects of the energy, the clean requirements, and our effective peak capacity. So all of this would come together to create the portfolio.
All
I think
right.
there's a question.
Yep. Aliza?
Well, I don't know if it's a question, really. It's an appreciation, because I know I had asked for more information about how your recent acquisitions that you shared would fulfill these needs. And I know you had showed it, I think, on the clean energy requirements, but not for the whole portfolio. So I think it's just a helpful way to understand the progress that you're making. And so I just wanted to thank you for this.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Aliza. Any questions or comments for Elizabeth? Okay. Elizabeth, does that wrap us up, or did you have any final comments or words?
I think this should be my last slide.
Okay.
So yeah, if there's any questions, let me know. We have a few minutes, but no, thank you.
Okay. All right. Any other questions overall for Elizabeth? Okay. All right. Thanks, Elizabeth. Well, we'll move into next steps. And with that, thanks, Will, for moving us over to the next slide. Ray, I was going to have you speak to the changes on the schedule coming up. Ray, are you available to do that?
I am, and I think I'm back. You can hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, awesome. As I mentioned in the chat earlier, this slide looks a little bit different from what you received in email a few days ago. What we decided to do was extend the feedback report, the feedback window for today's topics until January 17th, recognizing the holidays. We have an RPAG recruitment process going on, and this is a particularly complex and important topic. So a couple extra weeks there for you to think about this. Please feel free to send us questions, get your feedback in. And in exchange, we're canceling the January 29th meeting. That will also give us time to respond to your feedback and prepare for the February 26th meeting. The other benefit is it allows us to hopefully seat some new RPAG members before we get to February 26th. So that's the brief update. The two things in purple are the changes. And again, we look forward to hearing your feedback. Appreciate you being here today. I know that everyone is probably headed towards holidays here. So hopefully that extra time gives you a chance to let this sink in and get back to us.
Yeah. Thanks, Ray, and to PSE for being thoughtful about that. I know deciding to cancel a meeting is never easy. Okay. RPAG members, any questions about the schedule? Okay, well, I'll move us towards the public comment opportunity. Before we do that, this slide focuses on providing any feedback today. So Emily, if you can please just share the email and the feedback form in the chat for folks. There's also a voicemail number listed up on the screen. Love to hear your feedback. There's also an option to subscribe to an email list or see PSE's new website. So we'll put some of those links in the chat for you. And with that, want to see if there's anyone, as members of the public, we're going to move into the public comment opportunity piece of the meeting. If folks, if we can allow folks to raise their hands, that would be really helpful so that we can get a sense if anyone would like to provide public comments today. So Emily, if you can just let me know when that's allowed. And then I'll go through some of these ground rules. So one, we just ask that you raise your hand, of course, to let us know that you want to provide public comment. We have a 2-minute timer that I'll show on screen. If you do decide to provide public comment, will go in the order that the comments are received. We're hoping that we can ask you to keep any of the comments today relevant to those topics from today. That's also very helpful for us to just make sure that they're taken in kind. And then, of course, we do not want to engage in any personal attacks against RPAG members, guest presenters, or PSE staff, so we ask you kindly to refrain from that. Any questions or comments that are asked during this portion of the meeting are going to be included in the feedback report, so you can look for your answers there. And then RPAG members, you're always encouraged to stay for public comment if you're able. Okay, so do we have any members from the public wanting to provide comments today? Oh, and I saw Quinn's hand jump up.
That was a mistake.
Okay, just making sure. All right, I'm not seeing any hands up. Emily, I just want to confirm with you that we allowed folks to raise their hands.
Confirming that attendees are allowed to raise their hand, and I'm not seeing anything either.
Okay. Great. I'll just give you a few more moments, and that's fine if nobody has comments today. It's not a requirement. Okay, not seeing any. I guess we'll keep moving. So we won't be having any public comments today. I just want to thank you, observers and public participants, for joining. Very nice of you to take a couple hours out of your day to listen to this conversation and the questions and engage with us. And RPAG members, thank you all for engaging today, being present for these presentations, and asking your thoughtful questions. And presenters, we know that it is no small task to bring all this information to this space, so thank you. If you want to go to the next slide, Will. I think that's our last one for today. So if you need any more information regarding today's meeting, we have the agenda and the presentation deck up on the website. That's already in the chat, so we won't provide that again, but we just want to thank you all for being here today, and happy holidays. Take care, and we'll see you in 2025.
Thanks, Annie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.